The suffering of children in Yemen. The Saudi-led coalition and Houthi rebels who are at war with each other are both placed on a UN blacklist. Will that protect children whose rights they are accused of violating? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Sami Zeidan. The Saudi-led coalition has again been placed on a United Nations blacklist. The coalition's crime, killing and maiming 683 children in Yemen last year, as well as accusations of attacking schools and hospitals. But the annual draft report also notes the Saudi-led coalition has put measures in place to protect children. The United Nations doesn't punish nations on the list, but the hope is that the naming and shaming will force them to do more to protect civilians. The Saudi-led coalition was on the blacklist last year, but removed after Saudi pressure on the UN Secretary General. Well, the report also blacklists the Houthis, government forces and their militia allies. Human Rights Watch has been documenting the violations in Yemen since the war began. It found 58 unlawful strikes, which killed nearly 800 people. Homes, hospitals, schools and mosques were hit. The human rights investigators accused the coalition of using banned cluster munitions in at least 16 attacks on populated areas. And they say Houthi and allied forces laid numerous landmines which have injured dozens of people. Let's take a closer look at who's supporting the military action in Yemen then. Saudi Arabia leads a coalition of Arab, African and Asian countries. They receive military advice and support from the United States, the UK, Belgium, France and Turkey. Among the opponents to the Saudi-led military operation against the Houthis are Iran, China and Russia. Let's bring our panel in then. From Sana'a we have Hakim Al-Masmari, the editor of the Yemen Post. From Washington, D.C., we have Kate Kiver, Director of Policy and Advocacy at the Yemen Peace Project. And via Skype from London, Christine Beckerley, Yemen researcher with Human Rights Watch. If I could start with Christine. You know, the blacklist, it's a draft, it's going to be made public and so on. Do you think the Saudi-led coalition will eventually be blacklisted and that will be upheld despite any pressure or objections?
I think, first of all, thank you very much for having me. But I think that if the UN bases its listing off of its own evidence, right, just looking at the evidence that it has in front of it in regards to the coalition killing and maiming kids, attacking schools and hospitals, then the coalition deserves to be on the list. I think from our perspective, violations continue, and there's sort of enough evidence to show that even in 2017, so the period after this reporting period, we've documented more airstrikes where there's been very high children casualty tolls. We've looked at in 2017 the coalition hitting schools. So from our perspective, the coalition, rightly so, deserves to be on the UN Secretary General's list, as do many other parties to the conflict in Yemen.
Deserving to be on the list doesn't always mean you get to make it on the list, though. Several of the UN veto powers supply coalition members with weapons, Kate. How much support do you see within the UN for this listing?
I think there's growing support for this listing within the UN, and I think Secretary General Guterres is standing strong in the face of Saudi pressure. And I also think the passage of the resolution last week by the UN Human Rights Council that impaneled a group of eminent experts to document abuses by all sides to the conflict in Yemen also shows that Saudi pressure is not getting them to where it used to get them, particularly last year when they were able to stave off a resolution of an international inquiry and also remove themselves from the blacklist. So I think that there's growing calls within the international community for accountability, and this represents a first step towards that accountability.
Hakim, does it look likely to you that the Security Council might follow up? It's going to have to debate this issue. Do you think it'll follow up with any actual punitive measures?
Again, words don't count when it comes to the Yemen war. Yes, there are condemnation happening right now, but as these are happening, yesterday alone, 4 children were killed and 2 mothers in an airstrike in the Yemen region of Sa'ada. Today, a father and his child were killed today in another airstrike. So while these investigations are ongoing, this pressure on Saudi Arabia is ongoing. The killing of children continues in Yemen yesterday and today. An entire family of 12 all killed, 6 of them women and children killed. No condemnation on that. The problem is that the civilians are paying the price of war. The Houthis or the Saudi-led coalition forces are not losing anything. They have the Houthis have the finances and the manpower, while Saudi has the manpower. They're not losing. It's the people, it's the children, it's the innocent civilians who are paying the price of Yemen war, and this is why this war must come to an end.
Well, let me jump in there, Hakeem. It sounds like you're saying, let me take that point to Kate then. It sounds like, listening in to what Hakeem is saying there, some anecdotal information. Does it look like the blacklist is not likely to dissuade countries from continuing to employ the same sort of tactics we've seen?
I mean, Saudi abuses by the coalition have continued with impunity throughout this war, despite verbal condemnations and, the recent UNSC presidential statement that also condemns Saudi actions in blocking humanitarian assistance. So,
do you think any of that will change now, though, Kate?
I think there's starting to be baby steps towards it changing, but until the US and UK actually take verifiable action and start limiting its assistance to the coalition, their behavior likely will not change. The only time we saw a change in behavior by the coalition was, and it was a small change in behavior, was when the US put partial arms sales on hold under the Obama administration due to gross violations of human rights and airstrikes that were targeting civilian areas. So there needs to be more action, particularly from the backers of the coalition. And I think domestically in each country, in the UK and the US, there's growing domestic opposition to involvement and backing of the coalition. And it's really reaching a fever pitch. So again, I think this blacklist is a good first step, but more must be done.
Well, pick up more on that point which you mentioned about action from the backers. But before we go down that route, I want to bring Christine back into the discussion. What does being put on a UN blacklist mean for accountability in practical terms?
Well, I think one of the things that really struck me about the whole situation last year in terms of the Saudi-led coalition or Saudi Arabia and its allies putting all of this pressure on the UN to take them off the list. So you can see that in one light where it says, okay, what's the purpose of these lists if people can politically pressure the UN to get off? You can see it in another light whereby countries really don't want to be listed. Countries, including Saudi Arabia and its allies, don't want to be on lists like this because they know it looks bad and they know it has a reputational cost for them. And they're going to have to answer to their allies, ideally, about why they're on this list. If it's not just Human Rights Watch, it's not just Amnesty International, it's not just Yemeni groups, it's now the UN also saying that there's really terrible things happening in Yemen, and the Saudi-led coalition is to blame for some of those things.
Hakeem, Kate mentioned a moment ago there the idea of perhaps greater action from the backers to the parties in this conflict. Do you think that's likely now? If you're on a UN blacklist, does that mean those who may be supplying you with weapons as a party to this combat may start to have second thoughts? Are you hopeful of that, Hakeem?
Those who did sell the weapons to Saudi Arabia or other parties involved in this war have already sold their weapons. These international actions are happening 2.5 years too late. So I do feel that this time will be different, but Saudi knows that it will not see its arms twisted, especially since the killing of children is continuing, as we saw yesterday and today in Yemen. So yes, it will have an effect, but not to the extent that Saudi Arabia will stop its attacks. But this is rather than a phase where it's the end of the war in Yemen, rather than trying to force Saudi Arabia or try to condemn Saudi for doing its violent acts against children. Now, when I say Saudi, I don't mean only Saudi. The Houthis also commit some violations against civilians and children. But why the focus is on Saudi is because the majority of those who are killed, children killed, are by these airstrikes. Sadly, not to mention, as Christine said earlier, who's done a great job in Yemen, the schools that were attacked. And what Kate mentioned, the hospitals that were attacked. These children are the victims of this war.
Kate, do we know what measures when the UN... Sorry, go ahead, Kate. You wanted to jump in. Let me give you a chance to finish your thought first.
I was just going to say, Sami, that I think I think it's also important to note that the focus is really on the coalition because that's where the international community really has leverage to push for change. And I think the blacklist is very important, like Christine was saying, that it starts creating this evidentiary body to start talking about not only a commission of inquiry, but also sending cases of violators to The Hague eventually and demanding that accountability. And it also gives domestic audiences in the US and UK when these arms sales are being debated and other forms of military support, that these violations can no longer be swept under the rug. The UN has
But hang on, Kate, when we talk about evidentiary body, for who to take action? Who can pursue a case against any of the parties to this conflict? We have to bear in mind, of course, there are accusations against the Houthis and their backers as well of committing violations of war laws.
Absolutely. All parties to the conflict have committed violations of the laws of war.
So where do you take them to court if you wanted to?
In theory, it could be the ICC. There's also there's this issue of universal jurisdiction that countries can institute, and should a party to this conflict travel there, they can be detained and sent to The Hague. I also think it's important to note that there's also domestic litigation options here that more and more bodies within the UK and the US are starting to explore because as for example, the U.S. continues to provide security assistance to the Saudi coalition. There are U.S. laws that actually prohibit that assistance when a country has a documented pattern of gross violations of human rights, as well as blocking humanitarian assistance. So I think there's likely also, if this international stage or the UN isn't necessarily the body that is ready to take action here due to this kind of pressure from Saudi Arabia and its allies.
All right.
I think there's likely to be more and more.
You raised some good points there, but since Christine started this whole point of evidentiary body, let me take it full circle and back to Christine. When Kate mentioned a moment ago that perhaps an option in theory could be the ICC or even domestic litigation, we're talking about countries which at the same time have supported some of the parties to the conflict by supplying them weapons. So how realistic are any of those options, Christine?
Well, I mean, you've already seen some legal action, right? So in the UK, the topic of exports of UK arms to Saudi Arabia is the subject of ongoing litigation, and that's a big deal. I think in the US it hasn't been explored as much, but there certainly are sort of ways to look at what's ongoing in terms of US support to the coalition from a legal angle, right? Is the US aiding and abetting coalition war crimes? That's a real question that should be considered, particularly given the evidence that US weapons produced long after the start of the war ended up at the scene of apparently unlawful attacks, potential war crimes. And I think one of the things that we continue to push for is that, what will happen with legal action is a question, and it very much depends on whether or not courts take these questions up, but also whether or not there's enough evidence built and information gained on the perpetrators of crimes. And that's a long road, but at the same time, that road is worth walking because ultimately, even the threat of future litigation, even the threat of future prosecution might make, and it's a maybe, but it's very much it's the hope, might make the parties better comply with the laws of war in the now, and that itself would have a concrete impact on Yemeni civilians' lives.
Hakeem, from how it looks to you in sitting there in Yemen, the UN report references improvements made by the Saudi-led coalition to try and avoid civilian casualties. Do you see a difference?
It's not only by the airstrikes, it's what's caused by this war, the siege that Saudi-led coalition is behind. At least 10,000 people, majority children, women, have been killed by this, died by the siege, more than the airstrikes. So you have the epidemic, you have the airstrikes, you have the siege, different areas in Yemen that civilians are paying the price, and not only the war. Homes, you have at least 70,000 homes that are reported right now, according to the health ministry in Sana'a, that has been destroyed or damaged by the airstrikes. So why are homes attacked? Why are schools attacked? Why are hospitals attacked? These civilians have nothing to do with the war. And what's sad is that these actions are happening now rather than 2.5 years ago when they first started. So the lack of effort in the past has making this issue very, very serious. And Yemenis have basically lost hope to when it comes to counting on the international community, especially after the entire year of 2017 has seen a complete pause or silence when it comes to the casualties, the civilian casualties in Yemen. And again, Saudi is not suffering. The Houthis are not suffering. It's the civilians who are paying the price of war. It's the people, it's the innocent children, women who are dying of hunger, who are dying with the lack of medical attention, who are dying for the simplest reasons or diseases. The cholera right now, at least 500,000 children could be affected with cholera in Yemen, and their lives are in danger.
We're talking about the international community. The UN says Yemen is facing the largest humanitarian crisis in the world that Hakeem was alluding to there. Now, since the war started in March 2015, more than 8,000 people have been killed. About 50,000 have been injured. More than half of those who died were civilians, not to mention the millions who've been displaced. On top of that, the country is also dealing with a cholera outbreak that has killed about 2,000 people since April, and it's facing a food shortage. The conflict has pushed more than 17 million people to the brink of famine. But with blockades on the ports and airport, getting that aid and food supplies into the country is a huge challenge. So, Kate, I mean, we heard there from Hakeem about how, the situation is pretty bad. I wonder if the stats which your organisation perhaps keeps and researches show any change in the suffering, particularly of children, since, as apparently the UN says, there has been a change in tactics adopted by the Saudi-led coalition to avoid, targeting children.
I think these protections that are being cited are really Saudi lip service. We've seen similar rhetoric around protecting civilians in their airstrikes, and yet these abuses continue with impunity.
So hang on, Kate, you're saying your organisation has seen absolutely no change in the rate of civilian or child casualties in this war so far?
No, it has absolutely continued. And I think it's also important to note, as Hakeem did, that it's not just the Saudi airstrikes that are violating the rights of children and resulting in their deaths. It's also the fact that the coalition has systematically targeted civilian infrastructure, destroying water systems, sanitation systems, which have led to the cholera outbreak that we have now that have killed thousands of children or infected thousands more. It's the largest cholera outbreak ever documented in modern history, and it's purely man-made, as is the food shortage and famine, which has already started in certain areas of the country. So I think when, it's great that the UN blacklisted the Saudis. I think that them citing the fact that there's some protections to limit harm to children really is likely due to Saudi pressure. The August draft report of the blacklist did not include that aspect of Saudi having these protections. And
right.
So I really think that, these protections are something that the international community wants to see to feel better about continuing assistance and backing to the coalition.
Okay,
but on the ground, it has made no difference.
Right, we've got to also keep in mind that the blacklist is on pretty much all the parties to the conflict, not just the Saudi-led coalition.
Absolutely.
Does this blacklist, Christine, where does it leave efforts to get an international investigation?
Well, the amazing thing is that we've gotten an international investigation now. The question is, how effective is that international investigation going to be? And that's really up to member states of the UN. So on Friday, the Human Rights Council finally, at long last, after years of efforts by Yemeni activists, created an international inquiry and tasked that international inquiry with looking at violations by all sides. But the question is then, once they present that report, what do UN member states do with it? Or even before they present that report, what do UN member states do next? And I think, as has been raised on this call, leverage and pressuring the parties to stop violations of the laws of war is not just about investigating war crimes. It certainly is about that, and that's a big part of accountability, which many, many Yemenis have been pushing for a very long time. But it's also about concrete actions and taking steps that will, in fact, pressure the parties to actually change their behavior. So on the Houthis side, it is unbelievable that they're still using anti-personnel landmines. And like when you talk about kids, we've documented kids that have been killed or maimed by Houthi solid landmines or have not been able to return home. And it's also unbelievable that the Saudi-led coalition is still using US and UK weapons in unlawful attacks in Yemen. And yet you haven't seen the people who have leverage over those parties really go to task and say that, we're in the third year, this is unacceptable. And I think the question now is, one, will people take the mechanisms that have been put in place to push accountability and really allow them and help them be effective? And then two, will states take other action that will put concrete pressure on the parties to, in fact, change their behavior so that the daily life of Yemeni civilians actually changes?
Well, that's an interesting point. Let me take it to Hakeem Al-Masmari. Do you think people in Yemen have any greater hope today now that there is a UN list that is documenting, blaming both sides for doing things they shouldn't be doing in Yemen?
There's always hope, but the situation on the ground is heartbreaking. It's heartbreaking when you go to schools right now.
Is there hope of an international investigation actually leading somewhere on the part of most Yemenis, would you say, Hakeem?
Will they get justice? Will this war end? That's where the lack of hope is within the Yemeni community in Yemen here, where millions have seen their loved ones die, whether by Saudi-led coalitions or by the Houthi rockets, etc. But they've saw their loved ones die with no one caring. The international community is silent. The UN peace talks have halted. Schools right now are empty. Children are everywhere in the street corners begging, trying to seek food for their families. So how bad does it feel for someone who goes to school and sees empty classes? So this war has not only devastated or killed innocent civilian children, but also their future. How would you feel when schools are empty and the street corners are full of child labor or beggars? So this has destructed an entire generation in Yemen, and it's still continuing. So people are worried that this will continue and the world will still remain silent.
Well, we're talking about war, but we should remember to talk about peace as well. And Kate, your organization is the Yemen Peace Project. Do you think this UN listing in any way changes the prospects of peace? If it makes this war look a little more ugly to the world and makes the parties to this conflict a little more openly blamed, shall we say, does that increase the pressure for the diplomatic solution?
I mean, I think it should. Whether that actually translates into action by kind of the key players, the US and UK, it remains to be seen. I think that documentation like this and just the widespread documentation of abuses by all sides has led powers who maybe are not able to restart the peace process, like Secretary Tillerson or U.S. UN Ambassador Nikki Haley. But the U.S. Congress is now moving to limit U.S. support to the coalition because it's clear that this administration won't. And their goal really in doing actions like voting on a bill next week to end all U.S. military support to the coalition is really to send a message to this administration that a diplomatic solution is needed and the U.S. needs to be leading engagement with all sides to actually focus on end state solutions to get a peaceful settlement started. Right now, the UN process is stalled largely because it's really focused on ceasefires. It's not talking about kind of these big thorny issues that have remained the issues since really the Arab Spring uprising in 2011. Let alone dealing with the abuses and fallout from the current civil war. So I think it's important to start looking at other actors besides, the central governments of these backers. And so I think, we're also seeing that in the UK Parliament talking about ending support for the coalition. And that's really when I think, the coalition in particular could be pushed to the peace table. Because right now, I think they've been giving the signal by the US and also the UK that they can pursue a military-only course in Yemen and continue down this road to nowhere. But as these capitals start debating this more vigorously in public, I think that will send a clear message to the Saudis and the UAE and the rest of their allies that this course is no longer tenable. But at the same time, there needs to be engagement on the other side as well with the Houthi-Saleh alliance. And that means engaging with Iran. It means engaging with Oman. And really, we need the international community to lead lead on that type of engagement, to have more inclusive peace talks. But these first steps towards accountability, there is research that shows accountability can lead to more fruitful negotiations due to the threat of future accountability. So hopefully this could be kind of a starting point for that.
It's always nice to end with hopefully. Let's end with hope this time as well, and thank our guests very much for their participation. Kate Kiver, Christine Beckerly, and Hakeem Al-Masmari. And thank you too for watching. You can see the show again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, head over to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle there is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Sami Zeidan, and the whole team here for now, it's goodbye.